There was a time in America when you didn't lock your front door, not because you forgot, because you didn't need to. Kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Neighbors borrowed flour and returned eggs. Nobody worried about who was walking down the street. If you grew up in the 1950s, 60s, or early 70s, you know this feeling. And if you're wondering when it changed and why, stay with me. Because something happened. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's go back. Not to a fantasy, to a real documented moment in American life. The late 1950s and early 1960s. Crime rates in the United States were at historic lows. FBI data from that era shows violent crime was a fraction of what it would become just a decade later. In most American towns, the local police blotter was full of things like a cat stuck in a tree, or a noise complaint from the church social. Neighborhoods weren't just safe statistically, they felt safe. Kids walked to school alone. First grade, no chaperone. Parents sent them to the corner store with $1 and didn't blink. Front doors were left open in summer for the breeze. Screen doors were the only barrier between your family and the outside world. And that was fine. Neighbors knew each other's names. Not just next door, 3, 4 houses down. You knew whose kid that was. You knew when something looked wrong because you knew what right looked like. That's not nostalgia talking. That was the actual fabric of American community life. So when did it change? Most historians point to the mid to late 1960s as the turning point. Between 1963 and 1973, the violent crime rate in the United States more than doubled, not ticked up, doubled. There wasn't one single cause. There never is. But there were forces, economic, social, and structural, that hit American neighborhoods at the same time from multiple directions. The first was what historians call urban white flight. Millions of middle-class families, many of them white, but not exclusively, left city neighborhoods for the new suburbs. They were chasing better schools, bigger yards, the American dream as sold to them in post-war advertising. But what they left behind were communities suddenly stripped of tax base, investment, and stability. The second force was economic dislocation. Factory jobs that had kept working-class neighborhoods stable for a generation began disappearing. Not slowly, but fast. Automation, offshoring, plant closings. When work leaves a neighborhood, everything else follows. The third force was the breakdown of what sociologists call informal social control. That's the academic term for what your grandmother just called knowing your neighbors. When people don't know each other, don't trust each other, don't feel invested in the same place, the invisible web that holds a community safe begins to tear. Here's what people often miss when they talk about this era. It wasn't just that people were nicer back then. Those neighborhoods had structure, real, functional, everyday structure. There were third places, mulpi, that's what sociologists call them. Not home, not work. The third place, the barbershop, the diner, the front stoop, the church basement. These were places where people gathered with no agenda except to be together. And in those places, trust was built. Slowly, steadily, over years. You didn't just know your neighbor's name, you knew their kids, you knew their dog, you knew their routine. So when something was off, you noticed. That informal surveillance, that collective watchfulness. Criminologists call it eyes on the street. And it was the most powerful crime deterrent ever invented. It didn't cost anything. It required no technology. It was just people in relationship with each other, caring about the same place. The other thing those neighborhoods had, stability. People stayed, not forever, but long enough for roots to form, long enough for trust to build, long enough for kids to grow up knowing every shortcut, every safe house, every neighbor who'd let you use their phone in an emergency. By the 1970s, many of the neighborhoods that had once been the safest places on Earth had transformed, not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. The local hardware store was replaced by a big box chain 2 towns over. The diner closed, the factory shut down. Young families moved to new subdivisions where no one had lived before, where there was no history, no web, no roots. And something else happened too. Television changed how Americans spent their evenings. Instead of sitting on the porch, people sat in front of the screen. Instead of street life, there was living room life. That's not a moral judgment, it's just what happened. And when people retreated inside, the streets emptied. And when the streets emptied, eyes on the street disappeared. And when that disappeared, the invisible protection went with it. None of these things on their own were enough to break a community, but all of them together, that was enough. If you grew up in those neighborhoods, you remember something that's genuinely hard to describe to people who didn't. It wasn't just safety, it was belonging. It was the feeling of walking down a street where every face was at least vaguely familiar, where you were seen, where someone would notice if you needed help. That isn't a small thing, and here's what the research says. Because researchers have studied this, the communities that maintain that sense of cohesion, that informal trust, those third places, they held on longer. They didn't fall the same way. It wasn't magic, it was relationship. So here's my question for you. Do you remember your neighborhood from back then? What street did you grow up on? Who were your neighbors? Was there a corner store, a barber, a church social, a block party? Leave it in the comments, because these memories matter. They're not just nostalgia, they're a map of what made something work and what we might build again. If this brought back something real for you, subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. Next week, the full-service gas station. When the man came out to pump your gas, check your oil, and wash your windshield, and why that disappeared too. See you then.